At exactly 9:15 a.m. on a Thursday, the screens on the trading floor of Titan Corp turned a dead, unyielding black. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a temporary lag. The entire core infrastructure responsible for billions of dollars in real-time logistics and global data processing simply flatlined. Julian Vance stood in his glass-walled corner office, his dark eyes locked on the chaotic floor below. At 34, Julian had built a reputation as a ruthless, calculating CEO. He demanded perfection, and he paid generously for it. Titan Corp was his empire built on precision and cutting-edge architecture. It did not crash, and yet his phone was already vibrating endlessly against the mahogany desk. His assistant, Sarah, rushed into the office, her face drained of color. "Mr. Vance, we have a catastrophic failure in the primary routing modules. The entire network is down. Clients are completely locked out." "I can see that," Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and strode past her, heading straight for the engineering pit. "Where is Nathaniel?" "Mr. Reed is already in the server room with the senior developers," Sarah said, practically jogging to keep up with his long strides. When Julian pushed open the doors to the engineering department, the noise hit him like a physical blow. Phones were ringing off the hooks. Developers were shouting over each other, typing frantically on secondary diagnostic laptops. Nathaniel Reed, the VP of Engineering, stood in the center of the madness, his normally slick hair disheveled. He was barking orders at a young developer who looked like he was on the verge of a panic attack. "Nathaniel?" Julian's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. The shouts instantly died down. Nathaniel turned, swallowing hard. "Julian, we're experiencing a cascading failure. It's a core structural collapse. We're trying to isolate the broken sequence now." "How long until we are back online?" Julian asked, stopping inches from Nathaniel. "Hours, maybe a day," Nathaniel stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "It's a massive architecture issue. The code is unraveling." Julian's jaw tightened. A day means we lose 3 major contracts and face multi-million-dollar lawsuits. You are the VP of Engineering. You built this system. Fix it. Nathaniel's eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. The foundational layers are extremely complex. The diagnostics aren't giving us a clear entry point." Julian didn't miss that hesitation. He stepped past Nathaniel and walked up to the main diagnostic monitor. Lines of red error codes were scrolling at lightning speed. Julian was a billionaire now, but he had started as a coder. He knew enough to recognize when a system was fighting back. "Stop the scrolling," Julian ordered the young developer sitting at the terminal. "Pull up the origin point of the first cascading failure." The developer's fingers flew across the keyboard. The screen froze on a dense block of encrypted back-end logic. "Look at the syntax," Julian murmured, leaning closer. The code was elegant, almost poetic in its efficiency, but right now it was aggressively locked down. "This isn't standard framework. Who wrote this specific sequence?" Nathaniel stepped up quickly. "It's an aggregate. The team wrote it months ago. It's a legacy issue." "Bullshit," Julian said softly. He pointed a long finger at a tiny string of characters buried in the metadata at the bottom of the screen. //auth.ch, override protocol. Julian turned his sharp gaze to Nathaniel. "Who is CH?" Nathaniel's face went entirely pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I asked you a question, Nathaniel. Who is CHH? Julian's tone left no room for evasion. The room was dead silent. Finally, a junior developer in the back raised his hand nervously. Sir, that's Clara. Clara Hayes. Julian searched his memory. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but Titan Corp had over 2,000 employees. Where is she? Get her down here right now. Nathaniel cleared his throat, his voice tight. She doesn't work here anymore, Julian. Since when? Since last week, Nathaniel said, trying to regain his composure. She was a mid-level developer. She was terminated due to consistent performance issues and an inability to integrate with the team. She was a liability. Julian stared at the VP. You fired the person who wrote the foundational core of our billion-dollar routing system because of performance issues. She didn't write the core, Nathaniel countered quickly, his voice defensive. She contributed to it. I designed the architecture. She was just difficult. She refused to follow protocols. Julian looked back at the screen. The elegance of that code didn't belong to Nathaniel Reed. Nathaniel was a politician, a man who managed upwards. This code was the work of a genius they had just thrown out on the street. Get her on the phone, Julian ordered. Julian, she won't help us, Nathaniel said, his frustration leaking through. She was incredibly bitter when she left. I don't care if she cursed this entire building on her way out. Get her on the phone, Julian commanded, his voice echoing in the silent room. Sarah, his assistant, quickly pulled up the HR files on her tablet. She tapped a number and put the phone on speaker, holding it out. It rang 3 times. Hello. The voice on the other end was soft, tired, and distinctly feminine. Clara Hayes, Julian asked, leaning toward the phone. Yes. Who is this? This is Julian Vance, CEO of Titan Corp. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. In the background, Julian could hear the faint sound of a child's cartoon playing. Congratulations, Clara finally said, her voice entirely flat. Miss Hayes, our primary routing system just suffered a catastrophic failure. The origin point points to your override protocols. We need you to come in and fix it. We will compensate you handsomely for your time. Another pause. Then a dry, humorless laugh echoed through the speaker. Mr. Vance, I don't work for you anymore. Your VP of Engineering made that abundantly clear last Friday, when he had security escort me out with a cardboard box. Julian shot a lethal glare at Nathaniel. I am aware of your termination. I am overriding it. Name your price. I don't have a price, Clara said quietly. And I don't want your money. You fired me for incompetence after I warned your team for 6 months that the core would collapse if they kept patching it with cheap integrations. Nathaniel didn't listen. He just put his name on my reports and told me to stay quiet. Nathaniel stepped forward, his face red. That is an absolute lie. Quiet, Julian snapped, holding up a hand. He spoke back into the phone, his voice softening just a fraction. Clara, thousands of clients depend on this infrastructure. Hospitals' emergency logistics supply chains. If you know how to stop this, I am asking you to do it. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do when overloaded with bad code, Clara replied. It shut down to prevent a total data corruption. It's not broken, Mr. Vance. It's protecting itself from your people. Have a nice day. Wait. The line went dead. Julian stood in the center of the room, the silence thick and suffocating. He slowly turned to Nathaniel, his eyes cold and dark. "She warned you about this. She's lying," Nathaniel insisted, though his hands were trembling. "She's a bitter, disgruntled former employee trying to extort us." "She specifically just said she didn't want my money," Julian pointed out smoothly. He turned to Sarah. "Pull Clara Hayes's complete personnel file. I want her hiring contract, her performance, reviews her project submissions, and her home address." "Julian, you can't be serious," Nathaniel protested. "You're going to trust a fired single mom over your VP?" Julian paused, his gaze slowly dragging over Nathaniel. "If I find out you lied to me, Nathaniel, you won't just be fired. I will make sure you never work in this hemisphere again." Julian grabbed his suit jacket from a nearby chair. "Keep trying to isolate the code. I am going to see Miss Hayes. Sir, she lives in the East End," Sarah warned softly as she handed him a printed slip of paper. "It's not a great neighborhood." "I don't care if she lives on the moon," Julian said, taking the paper. "Have my driver bring the car around. Now." The rain started to fall as Julian's sleek black Maybach glided through the narrow pothole-riddled streets of the East End. The contrast was glaring. His car cost more than most of the apartment buildings lining the block. Julian sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted window at the graffiti-covered brick walls and the overflowing dumpsters. This was where the architect of his billion-dollar routing system lived. "Wait here," Julian instructed his driver as the car pulled to a stop in front of a weathered 4-story walk-up. He stepped out into the drizzle, his expensive Italian leather shoes splashing into a shallow puddle on the uneven pavement. He didn't care. His mind was entirely focused on the woman who had just hung up on him. Julian Vance was a man who commanded boardrooms, negotiated multinational mergers, and dictated the future of global tech. People did not hang up on him, but more importantly, people who wrote code of that caliber did not get fired for incompetence. He pushed open the heavy glass-paned front door. The lock was broken. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of stale cabbage and damp wood. Julian ignored the flickering fluorescent light overhead and bypassed the out-of-order elevator, taking the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor. He found apartment 3B. The paint on the door was chipped, exposing the cheap wood underneath. He raised his hand and knocked the sound loud and authoritative in the quiet hallway. He waited. He could hear soft footsteps approaching from the inside, then the click of a deadbolt turning. The door opened just a few inches, held fast by a tarnished security chain. A pair of striking, exhausted hazel eyes peered out at him. "Clara Hayes?" Julian asked, his deep voice filling the narrow space. The door closed for a second. The chain rattled as it was unhooked, and then it opened fully. Clara stood there, arms crossed defensively over a faded, oversized college sweatshirt. She was smaller than he had pictured, barefoot, with her dark wavy hair pulled up into a messy knot secured by a single pencil. She didn't look like a disgruntled, vindictive ex-employee. She looked tired, bone-tired, but the way she lifted her chin and met his gaze was pure steel. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice steady, "I didn't think billionaires made house calls, especially not in this zip code." "I told you the system is failing. I don't have time for middlemen," Julian replied, his eyes taking in the small space behind her. The apartment was tiny, the furniture clearly second-hand, but it was impeccably clean. A small kitchen table was covered in hand-drawn sketches and printed code matrices. "May I come in?" "No," Clara said flatly. Julian blinked. "Excuse me?" "You can't come in," she repeated, not moving an inch. "I don't invite people who threw me out on the street into my home." "I did not fire you, Miss Hayes. Nathaniel Reed did." "And Nathaniel Reed reports to you," Clara countered sharply. "It's your company, your culture, your VP who steals reports and fires the people who actually do the work. So respectfully, whatever is happening to your servers right now is your problem, not mine." Julian studied her. Most people wilted under his gaze. Clara stood her ground, radiating a quiet, fierce dignity. "I am aware there is a discrepancy in what Nathaniel told me and what you claim," Julian said, his tone shifting, becoming more measured. "If he stole your work, I will deal with him. But right now, I need you to unlock the override protocol. Name your price, Clara. 100,000. 500,000. I can have the funds wired to your account before you even sit down at a terminal." Clara's eyes widened slightly at the sum, a brief flash of vulnerability betraying her calm facade, but she quickly masked it. She shook her head. "It's not about the money. Everything is about money," Julian said smoothly. "Maybe in your world," Clara snapped her hands, gripping the edge of the door. "In my world, it's about survival, and I barely survived working for Titan Corp. Do you know what it's like to work 80-hour weeks to build an architecture from scratch, only to have your VP rip your name off the documentation? Do you know what it's like to be called into a room, told you are difficult and uncooperative, and handed a cardboard box?" Julian frowned. "If this is true, why didn't you go to HR? Clara let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "I did. Twice. They CC'd Nathaniel on my complaints. 3 days later, I was fired. Your HR department isn't there to protect employees, Mr. Vance. It's there to protect the company." Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The realization that his empire was rotting from the inside out was sickening. He looked at her, really looked at her. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her oversized sweater swallowed her small frame, the slight tremble in her hands that she was desperately trying to hide. "Mommy," a small, sleepy voice broke the tension. Julian looked past Clara. A little boy, no older than 7, wandered into the small entryway. He was wearing faded superhero pajamas and clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. His skin was too pale, and he looked incredibly fragile, like a child who had spent far too much time inside hospital walls. Clara's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The steel in her spine melted into pure protective warmth. She turned, crouching down to the boy's level, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper. "Hey, sweetie, I thought you were napping." "I heard talking," the boy murmured, rubbing his eyes. He peeked over Clara's shoulder and stared at Julian. "Are you the bad boss?" Julian froze. He had faced down hostile boards of directors and aggressive corporate raiders without flinching, but the innocent, direct question from a 7-year-old boy felt like a physical strike to his chest. Clara sighed, running a hand through her son's hair. "Leo, this is Mr. Vance. He's just leaving." "Did he come to take our apartment away too?" Leo asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Because of the money." "No, baby. No one is taking our apartment," Clara reassured him quickly, pulling him into a tight hug. She looked up at Julian, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce protective fire. The message was clear. "Look at what your company did to us." Julian stared down at the mother and son. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces snapped together. The exhaustion, the desperate need for a job, the brilliance of her code combined with her absolute refusal to fight a massive corporate legal battle. She wasn't just a disgruntled employee. She was a single mother fighting a solitary war to keep a roof over her sick child's head, and Titan Corp had crushed her. "I apologize for the intrusion," Julian said, his voice softer than it had been in years. He wasn't apologizing just for the visit. He was apologizing for all of it. Clara stood up, keeping Leo tucked behind her legs. "I told Nathaniel 6 months ago that the integration nodes were unstable. I wrote the override protocol to catch the system before the bad code could corrupt the main databases. It's a failsafe. It will hold the data securely until you rebuild the integration layers. But I am not going to fix it for him. He broke it. Let him figure it out." "He doesn't have the intellectual capacity to figure it out," Julian said honestly. "And frankly, I don't want him touching your architecture ever again." Clara crossed her arms. "Then you better find someone who can." "I am looking at her." "I said no, Mr. Vance. I signed a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete when they fired me mostly so they wouldn't dispute my unemployment claim. I am legally bound not to touch Titan Corp's servers. I am done." She started to close the door. "Clara," Julian said, stepping forward, his hand catching the edge of the door. He didn't push, just held it firmly. "I didn't know what was happening in my own engineering department. That is my failure as a CEO. But I swear to you, if you give me the chance, I will make this right. Not just the servers. I will make what happened to you right." Clara looked at his hand on the door, then up at his face. For a fleeting second, Julian saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a desperate desire to believe that someone finally was going to fight for her. But years of hardship and betrayal quickly extinguished it. "Words are cheap, Mr. Vance," Clara said quietly. "Even from billionaires. Goodbye." She pushed the door, and this time Julian let his hand drop. The door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding firmly into place. Julian stood in the dim, stale hallway for a long minute, listening to the muffled sounds of Clara comforting her son inside. His chest felt unusually tight. He had come here expecting a negotiation, a transaction. He had expected to throw money at a problem until it disappeared. Instead, he had found a brilliant, battered woman holding the remnants of her life together with sheer willpower. He turned and walked back down the stairs, his mind working at a furious pace. When he slid back into the leather seats of the Maybach, his driver looked back at him through the rearview mirror. "Back to the office, sir." "Yes," Julian said, pulling out his phone. His voice was no longer measured or calm. It was lethal. He dialed his assistant. "Sarah," Julian barked the moment she picked up. "Call legal. I want a team of forensic auditors in the engineering department in 20 minutes. They are to seize Nathaniel Reed's hard drives, his personal devices, and his email servers. No one leaves that floor." "Right away, sir." Did Miss Hayes agree to help?" Julian looked out the window at the dilapidated building as the car pulled away from the curb. He thought of Clara's fierce eyes and the pale, frightened face of her little boy. "No," Julian said softly. "But she's going to get her justice anyway, because I am going to burn Nathaniel Reed to the ground." By the time Julian's Maybach pulled back into the underground garage of Titan Corp, it was late afternoon. He took the private elevator directly to the engineering floor, expecting to walk into a war zone. Instead, as the polished steel doors slid open An eerie, exhausted quiet blanketed the pit. Julian stepped out. The massive digital dashboards that had been bleeding red error codes for hours were now bathed in a steady rhythmic green. The system was online. The data flows were stabilizing. Nathaniel Reed stood at the center of the room, holding a cup of coffee, looking incredibly smug. When he saw Julian, he puffed out his chest, stepping forward with a triumphant smile. "Julian, we did it," Nathaniel announced loud enough for the exhausted developers to hear. "It was a grueling battle, but I managed to isolate the corrupted sequence and push a patch through the main firewall. The routing core is fully operational. We didn't lose a single client." Julian stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Nathaniel, taking in the arrogant posture, the self-satisfied smirk. Then he looked past him to the main terminal where the junior developer from earlier was staring at his screen with a deeply confused expression. "Is that true, Mr. Davis?" Julian asked, his voice cutting through the room's hum. The young developer jumped slightly in his chair. Well, sir, the system is definitely fixed." "Did Mr. Reed write the patch?" Nathaniel's smile faltered. "Julian, the team worked cohesively under my direction." "I asked Mr. Davis." Julian interrupted smoothly, not taking his eyes off the young man. "Answer the question." Davis swallowed hard, his fingers trembling over the keyboard. "No, sir. Mr. Reed didn't write it. We didn't write it. 3 minutes ago, an encrypted micropatch bypassed our external firewalls. It was entirely anonymous. It recompiled the core logic, locked down the unstable integration nodes, and rebooted the servers. It took exactly 14 seconds. Julian felt a sudden profound shift in his chest, a strange mixture of awe and deep visceral respect. Asterisk Clara. Asterisk. She had told him to his face that she wouldn't help him. She had rejected his money and shut the door on him, but she had listened when he mentioned the hospitals and the emergency supply chains. She couldn't stomach the thought of innocent people suffering because of Titan Corp's incompetence. So she had logged on from her tiny apartment in the East End, bypassed a billion-dollar security system, like it was child's play, fixed the problem, and vanished without taking a dime or a shred of credit. "An anonymous patch," Nathaniel scoffed, trying to recover his footing. "Obviously a failsafe I implemented months ago finally kicked in. The architecture is mine, Julian. Nathaniel," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, "get out of my sight." "Excuse me. Go to your office. Do not touch a computer. Do not speak to your team. Wait for my instructions. If you so much as send an email, I will have security physically throw you out of this building." Nathaniel's face went chalk white. He opened his mouth, closed it, and quickly, practically fled the room. Julian turned on his heel and headed straight for the executive elevators. The system was safe. Now it was time to dissect the rot. At 11:00 p.m., the executive suite was completely deserted, save for the soft glow of light spilling from Julian's corner office. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering skyline of the city. Behind him, Arthur Pendleton, Titan Corp's head of legal and internal security, was organizing a thick stack of printed files on the mahogany desk. Arthur was 60 sharp as a razor and one of the few men Julian explicitly trusted. "You were right to call for the audit, Julian," Arthur said grimly, breaking the silence. The forensic team pulled Nathaniel's internal communications, his private server backups, and the HR logs. It's a bloodbath. Julian turned away from the window, his jaw clenched. Show me. Arthur slid a blue folder across the desk. Let's start with the intellectual property theft. It's staggering. Over the last 3 years, Clara Hayes single-handedly designed, coded, and implemented the entire framework of our current routing infrastructure. We found dozens of emails from Nathaniel to his direct loyalists, explicitly ordering them to strip her metadata from the code. Arthur tapped a printed email. Here, Nathaniel writing to a senior dev. Remove CH tags from the architecture presentation. I'll be pitching this to the board on Friday. Ensure she is assigned to back-end maintenance during the meeting so she doesn't interfere. ... Asterisk. He systematically erased her Julian. Then he took the bonuses, the stock options, and the accolades for her genius. Julian stared at the email, his stomach churning with disgust. He remembered Clara's exhausted hollow eyes. Asterisk. Do you know what it's like to build an architecture from scratch, only to have your VP rip your name off? Asterisk. Why didn't she fight back? Julian asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. She's brilliant. She could have walked into any tech firm in Silicon Valley and demanded a massive salary. Why did she stay here and let him abuse her? Arthur let out a heavy sigh, pulling a second red folder from the stack. Because he held her hostage, legally and financially. Julian frowned, stepping closer to the desk. Explain. Clara was hired 4 years ago as a mid-level developer. Her original contract was standard, but 2.5 years ago, her son Leo was diagnosed with a severe, incredibly expensive autoimmune condition. The medical bills wiped out her savings in a matter of weeks. She needed premium health insurance, and she needed a massive cash advance to cover experimental treatments. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He pictured the pale, fragile little boy in the faded superhero pajamas. Asterisk. Did he come to take our apartment away too? Asterisk. She went to HR to request a medical hardship loan. Arthur continued, his voice heavy with disgust. Standard procedure dictates HR approves it based on tenure. But Nathaniel intervened. He told HR he would handle it personally. Arthur opened the red folder, revealing a signed addendum. He gave her the loan, and he ensured she kept her premium health benefits. But in exchange, he forced her to sign this: a predatory intellectual property waiver and a non-disclosure agreement. She effectively waived all rights to any code she wrote, past, present, and future, assigning sole architectural credit to the VP of Engineering. If she quit, or if she violated the NDA, the loan would be called in immediately, and her son's health coverage would be instantly terminated. Julian stared at Clara's signature at the bottom of the page. It was slightly shaky, the ink pressed hard into the paper. It was the signature of a terrified mother signing away her soul to keep her child alive. A cold, lethal fury settled into Julian's bones. It wasn't just corporate theft, it was extortion. It was pure, unadulterated cruelty. Under the roof of the company Julian had built, a man had weaponized a child's illness to enslave a genius. And last week, Julian asked, his voice deadly quiet, "Why fire her now?" "Because she stopped being compliant," Arthur said. She noticed the integration nodes were failing. She refused to keep building on bad code. She sent Nathaniel 3 separate risk assessment reports warning him the system would crash. We found them buried in his deleted files. When she threatened to go over his head directly to you, He panicked. He fired her for insubordination and invoked the non-compete to ensure no one else would hire her. He cut off her health insurance, Julian. The boy's treatments are suspended. The silence in the office was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside the glass. Julian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The weight of his own blindness crashed down on him. He had been so obsessed with profits with expansion, with the flawless image of Titan Corp, that he had built a machine that crushed the very people making it run. He had stood in Clara's doorway wearing a suit that cost more than her yearly rent, and tried to throw money at her, completely ignorant of the fact that his company was the reason she was bleeding. "Arthur," Julian finally spoke. His voice was no longer just the voice of a CEO. It was the voice of a man preparing for war. "Yes, Julian. Draft a termination letter for Nathaniel Reed. Cause gross misconduct, intellectual property theft, and extortion. But don't send it to HR yet." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You want to handle him yourself?" "I want to make an example of him," Julian corrected coldly. "I want the board of directors in the main conference room tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Mandatory attendance. Tell Nathaniel he will be presenting a full debrief on today's system crash." "Julian, the board loves Nathaniel," Arthur warned cautiously. "He has allies. Marcus Sterling and the old guard think Nathaniel is the reason our logistics division is so profitable. If you go after him without securing the board's backing first, they could call a vote of no confidence against you. You could lose the company." "Let them try." Julian sneered, his dark eyes burning with absolute conviction. "I don't give a damn about board politics right now, Arthur. I built Titan Corp. I can tear it down. But before I do, I am going to rip Nathaniel Reed's legacy to shreds, and I am going to give Clara Hayes back everything that was stolen from her. And then some." Arthur looked at the fierce, unwavering resolve in Julian's eyes and slowly nodded. He gathered the folders. "I will prepare the files for tomorrow's meeting. It's going to be a bloodbath, Julian." "Good," Julian whispered to the empty room as Arthur walked out. "Let them bleed." Julian pulled out his phone. He looked at the time. It was past midnight. He couldn't call her. Not yet. He had no right to step back into her life until he had a severed head to offer her on a silver platter. But as he stood looking out over the city, his thoughts weren't on the billion-dollar empire he had to defend tomorrow. His thoughts were consumed by a quiet, fierce woman in an oversized sweater and a brave little boy holding a stuffed bear. Asterisk. "Hang on, Clara." Asterisk. Julian thought his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany desk. Asterisk. "I am coming for them, and then I am coming back for you." At exactly 9:00 a.m. on Friday, the heavy oak doors of Titan Corp's executive boardroom swung shut, sealing in the 12 most powerful people in the company. The room was a fortress of glass and mahogany, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that Julian Vance owned. But today, Julian wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at the prey. Nathaniel Reed stood at the head of the massive table, a laser pointer in hand, projecting a slide of the stabilized routing architecture onto the smart glass wall. He looked impeccably groomed, practically glowing with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just saved a billion-dollar empire. "In conclusion," Nathaniel said, flashing a winning smile at the board of directors, "the cascading failure yesterday was a stress test scenario that pushed our legacy code to its limits. But thanks to the robust override protocols I designed and implemented months ago, we were able to patch the firewall and reboot the core with zero client attrition. The system is stronger than ever. A murmur of approval rippled down the table. Marcus Sterling, the oldest and most influential board member outside of Julian himself, nodded slowly. Excellent work, Nathaniel. Crisis management is what separates decent executives from great ones. You have the board's full support. Thank you, Marcus, Nathaniel replied smoothly, taking his seat. He shot a brief, smug glance toward Julian, who was sitting perfectly still at the far end of the table. Julian hadn't said a word since the meeting began. He had just watched his dark eyes unreadable, his hands steepled under his chin. Now the silence stretched thick and heavy as everyone waited for the CEO to speak. Julian slowly lowered his hands and leaned forward. The sheer gravity of his presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. An inspiring presentation, Nathaniel, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any warmth. A true triumph of engineering. Tell me when you wrote that override protocol. What syntax did you use for the asynchronous data loops? Nathaniel blinked, his smile freezing. Excuse me. The asynchronous data loops, Julian repeated softly. The ones that bypass the external firewalls in 14 seconds. Did you use a standard REST framework, or did you write a custom script? It was a highly customized script, Julian. Very technical. The team and I? Arthur? Julian interrupted, not raising his voice, but the command snapped through the room like a whip. Arthur Pendleton stepped out from the shadows near the door. He walked the length of the table, placing a thick, identical blue folder in front of every single board member. When he reached Nathaniel, he dropped the folder with a loud, heavy thud. "What is this?" Marcus Sterling asked, frowning as he flipped open the cover. "That," Julian said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket, "is the anatomy of a fraud. You will find timestamps, internal network logs, and dozens of emails sent from Nathaniel Reed's private server. You will also find the original unedited source code of our entire routing architecture, an architecture that, as you will clearly see, was not written by our esteemed VP of Engineering." The boardroom descended into chaos. Pages were flipped frantically. Marcus Sterling's face went pale as he read through the highlighted emails. "Julian, this is absurd," Nathaniel shouted, shooting out of his chair. "These are fabricated. You're trying to push me out because I have the board's backing." "Sit down," Julian commanded. The sheer lethal authority in his voice made Nathaniel physically drop back into his leather chair. "Page 12, Julian instructed the room, ignoring Nathaniel entirely. An email from Nathaniel to his lead developer. Quote, "Remove CH's tags from the architecture presentation. Ensure she is assigned to back-end maintenance during the meeting so she doesn't interfere." CH stands for Clara Hayes, a single mother and a mid-level developer who single-handedly built the system that makes this company billions. A woman whose entire intellectual legacy was stolen by the man sitting at the head of this table. "Julian, wait," Marcus Sterling interjected, holding up a hand. He looked deeply disturbed, but he was still a businessman. "If this is true, it's a severe HR violation, but the IP still belongs to Titan Corp. We can settle this quietly. A severance package for the girl, an NDA, and Nathaniel takes a quiet leave of absence. We cannot afford a public scandal. Nathaniel is the face of our logistics division." Julian slowly turned his head to look at Marcus. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You think this is just about stolen code, Marcus?" Julian asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He gestured to Arthur, who immediately began distributing a second set of folders. These were red. "Open the red folder," Julian commanded. The board members complied, their expressions shifting from shock to absolute horror as they read the documents inside. 2.5 years ago, Julian's voice rang out cold and merciless. Clara Hayes's 7-year-old son was diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disease. She was drowning in medical debt. She came to this company, to us, for a standard medical hardship loan, and Nathaniel Reed saw an opportunity. Julian walked slowly down the length of the table, stopping directly behind Nathaniel's chair. Nathaniel was trembling, his hands gripping the armrests so hard his knuckles were white. Nathaniel approved the loan and the health insurance. Julian continued, his voice dripping with disgust, but only after forcing her to sign an illegal predatory addendum, waiving all her intellectual property rights and signing away her architectural credit. He weaponized a child's life-threatening illness to enslave a genius. And last week, when she warned him the system was going to crash and refused to be complicit in his incompetence, he fired her. He invoked a non-compete to ensure she couldn't work anywhere else, and he terminated her son's health insurance. He effectively handed a death sentence to a 7-year-old boy to cover his own tracks. Complete stunned silence filled the boardroom. Even Marcus Sterling closed the red folder, looking physically sick. "This is extortion," one of the female board members whispered, staring at Nathaniel as if he were a monster. "It's monstrous." "It is a criminal offense," Julian corrected her. His eyes locked on Nathaniel. "And it happened under my roof." Nathaniel shook his head wildly, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Julian, you don't understand. She was going to take the code to a rival. I protected the company. I did what I had to do to protect our assets." "You protected yourself," Julian snarled, finally letting his rage bleed through. He slammed both hands down on the table, leaning directly into Nathaniel's face. "You took a brilliant, desperate mother and you bled her dry. And then you tried to take the credit when she logged on from a broken laptop in the East End and saved our system for free just because she didn't want innocent people to suffer." Julian straightened up, addressing the entire room. "Nathaniel Reed is terminated immediately. He will forfeit his severance, his stock options, and his pension. Arthur is currently turning over this entire dossier to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution regarding corporate extortion and fraud. And I will personally ensure that he never holds a job more complicated than making coffee for the rest of his miserable life." "Julian, you can't," Nathaniel panicked, looking around the table for an ally. "Marcus, you know what I've done for this company. You can't let him do this." Marcus Sterling looked at Nathaniel, then looked at Julian. The older man let out a long breath. "I have no sympathy for a man who uses a sick child as leverage. The board stands with Julian. You're done, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's mouth fell open. His entire empire, built on lies and stolen brilliance, had just evaporated in less than 10 minutes. "Arthur," Julian said softly. The boardroom doors opened and 4 large security guards stepped inside. "Mr. Reed is leaving," Julian said, turning his back on the ruined VP. "Escort him out through the main lobby. Let every single employee see what happens when you cross the line at Titan Corp. Then throw him on the street." "Julian." "You can't do this, Julian," Nathaniel screamed, as the guards grabbed him by the arms, dragging him away from the table. He kicked and struggled, his dignity entirely shattered, but Julian didn't even turn around to watch. The heavy doors closed behind them, cutting off Nathaniel's pathetic shouts. The boardroom was deathly quiet once again. The board members sat frozen still, processing the sheer brutality and precision of Julian's execution. "Now," Julian said, breaking the silence as he walked back to his seat at the head of the table. "We are going to fix the rot in this company. Arthur has drafted a full nullification of Clara Hayes's previous contracts. Furthermore, we are initiating a massive restructuring of the HR department to ensure this never happens again." Marcus cleared his throat cautiously. "And what about Miss Hayes? Julian, are we offering her a settlement? If she sues us for what Nathaniel did, it could be devastating." Julian looked out the window, his expression softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained fiercely determined. "No," Julian said quietly. "We are not offering her a settlement. We are offering her the position of Chief Technology Officer and a 5% equity stake in Titan Corp." A few board members gasped. 5%, Julian, that's hundreds of millions of dollars. It is exactly what her architecture is worth, Julian countered smoothly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. She built the foundation of this company's future. It's time she owned it. I am putting my own shares up to cover her equity. If anyone has an issue with this, I accept your resignation right now." No one moved. No one spoke. The board knew better than to challenge Julian Vance when he was in this state. He wasn't just a CEO protecting a company right now. He was a protector, a man driven by a profound personal mission. "Good," Julian said, buttoning his jacket. "Meeting adjourned." He didn't wait for them to stand. Julian walked out of the boardroom, his heart beating a fast, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had burned the villain to the ground. He had secured the kingdom. Now, he just had to convince the queen to take her throne. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Drop a comment below if you loved seeing Nathaniel finally get what he deserved. Do you think Clara will accept Julian's offer? The Friday evening air was remarkably crisp as Julian Vance stood outside the door of apartment 3B in the East End. It had been roughly 32 hours since she had shut this very door in his face. A lot had changed in 32 hours. He didn't knock right away. He stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway, holding a sleek black folder, feeling a strange flutter of nerves in his chest. Julian never got nervous. But then again, he had never met a woman like Clara Hayes. He raised his hand and knocked 2 firm raps. A moment later, the door opened. Clara stood there holding a dish towel, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She froze when she saw him, her hazel eyes widening in surprise, and perhaps a flicker of defensive panic. "Mr. Vance," she said cautiously, her grip tightening on the towel. "If you're here about the servers again—" "The servers are fine, Clara," Julian said softly. He didn't push his way in. He stood respectfully on the threshold. "I came to deliver this." He held out the black folder. Clara looked at it as if it might bite her, but slowly reached out and took it. "What is it?" she asked. "The first page is a formal nullification of the extortionate addendum Nathaniel Reed forced you to sign." Julian explained, his voice steady. "It is signed by me and the head of our legal department. Your intellectual property is yours again. The second page is a complete reinstatement of your son's premium health care, backdated with all out-of-pocket expenses fully reimbursed by Titan Corp. Clara's breath hitched. Her eyes darted from Julian to the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it to look at the documents. And Nathaniel, she whispered, almost afraid to ask. Nathaniel Reed was escorted out of the building by security at 9:30 this morning. Julian said, a dark satisfaction coating his words. He was fired for cause. His pension and stock options are forfeit, and our legal team has handed his hard drives over to federal authorities for criminal prosecution. He will never hurt you or anyone else ever again. A tear slipped free, tracking down Clara's cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, but another followed. The sheer crushing weight she had been carrying for years, the fear, the injustice, the quiet desperation, suddenly fractured. You really did it, she breathed, staring at him in disbelief. You burned him down. I told you I would, Julian said gently. But there is a third page in that folder, Clara. She flipped to the last document. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the heavy legal text. Chief Technology Officer, 5% equity. Julian, this is tens of millions of dollars. I can't accept this. It is not charity, Clara, Julian said firmly, stepping just an inch closer. You built the architecture that makes my company run. Without you, Titan Corp is a hollow shell. You earned every single cent of that equity, and I need a CTO who actually knows what the hell she is doing. I need you. Clara looked up at him. For the first time, the defensive walls in her eyes were gone. In their place was a profound, overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come to work on Monday, Julian replied, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. We have a routing system to optimize. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Monday morning at Titan Corp was entirely unprecedented. When the private executive elevator dinged open on the engineering floor, the pit went completely silent. Julian Vance stepped out impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, projecting his usual aura of absolute authority. But right beside him, walking with quiet confidence, was Clara Hayes. She wasn't wearing an oversized college sweater today. She wore a sharp-tailored navy blazer, her chin held high. Julian stopped in the center of the room. The developers, many of whom had watched Clara be humiliated and escorted out with a cardboard box just a week prior, stared in shock. Attention. Julian's voice echoed across the massive room. I am formally announcing a change in leadership. As of today, Clara Hayes is the Chief Technology Officer of Titan Corp. She has full autonomous control over the engineering department, the architecture, and personnel. Her word is the final law on this floor. If anyone has an issue reporting to the woman who actually built the system you work on, HR has a stack of resignation forms waiting for you. No one moved. Then, Mr. Davis, the junior developer, who had been terrified of Nathaniel, stood up from his desk and started clapping. Within seconds, a wave of applause swept through the room. Clara felt her chest tighten with emotion. She looked up at Julian, and he looked down at her, his eyes burning with fierce pride. Asterisk. This is what justice feels like. Asterisk, Clara thought. The transition was intense. For the next 3 weeks, Clara worked tirelessly to strip away Nathaniel's bloated, inefficient patches and rebuild the integration nodes properly. She practically lived in her new corner office. But she wasn't alone. Julian, the billionaire CEO who used to communicate with the engineering department purely through angry emails, was suddenly a constant presence. He brought her coffee in the mornings. He sat in the corner of her office during complex code compiles, silently working on his laptop just to keep her company. Their dynamic shifted from professional respect to something much deeper, much more electric. There was a quiet intimacy in the late nights they shared, surrounded by the glow of monitors and the silence of the sleeping city. It was a Thursday night, close to 8:00 p.m., when the reality of their new alliance truly hit home. Clara was massaging her temples, staring at a complex data matrix, when her office door opened. Julian walked in, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, holding Julian's large hand with absolute trust, was Leo. "Mommy!" Leo cheered, letting go of Julian to run over and hug Clara's legs. Clara gasped, catching her son and kissing the top of his head. "Leo, what are you doing here? Mrs. Higgins was supposed to be watching you until 9. Mrs. Higgins had a family emergency," Julian explained, setting 2 large paper bags from a high-end Italian restaurant on Clara's glass desk. "She called your cell, but it went to voicemail. So she called the corporate emergency contact line. It routed to my assistant. I had my driver take me to pick him up." Clara looked at Julian, stunned. You personally went to the East End to pick up my son." Julian shrugged casually, though his eyes were warm. "I figured he might be hungry, and I know you haven't eaten since noon." Leo pulled a small, sleek tablet out of his backpack. "Julian gave me an iPad for the car ride. It has all the superhero movies. Mommy." "He told me to call him Julian," the boy added, looking incredibly pleased. Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion. Julian Vance was a man whose time was worth thousands of dollars a minute. Yet he had dropped everything, navigated rush-hour traffic to a run-down neighborhood, and played babysitter, all so Clara wouldn't have to panic. They ate dinner together at the small conference table in Clara's office. It was surreal. Julian Vance, the ruthless corporate titan, was carefully twirling spaghetti onto a plastic fork for a 7-year-old boy, listening intently as Leo explained the complex lore of a cartoon alien. By 9:30 p.m., the heavy meal and the excitement caught up with Leo. He fell asleep on the plush leather sofa in the corner of the office, his head resting on Julian's discarded suit jacket. Clara stood by the window, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching her son sleep peacefully. The dark circles under Leo's eyes were fading, thanks to the new aggressive treatments Titan Corp's premium insurance was covering. He looked healthier than he had in years. Julian stepped up quietly beside her. He didn't crowd her, but he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "He's a good kid, Clara," Julian murmured, his deep voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "He's my whole world," Clara replied, keeping her eyes on Leo. "When Nathaniel threatened to take away his insurance, I broke Julian. I let him steal my work, my dignity, everything just to keep Leo safe. I felt like such a coward." "You weren't a coward," Julian said fiercely. Clara turned to look at him, startled by the raw intensity in his tone. "You were a mother, protecting her child against a monster. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen. Nathaniel was the coward." Julian reached out his long fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind Clara's ear. His touch was incredibly soft, a sharp contrast to the cold, calculating man the world saw. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, Clara," Julian said. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away all pretenses. "You don't ever have to be afraid again. I won't let anyone touch you, or him." Clara's breath hitched. She looked into Julian's eyes and saw exactly what he was offering. It wasn't just a job. It wasn't just protection. It was a partnership in every sense of the word. For years, she had carried the crushing weight of the world on her shoulders. Now, this powerful, brilliant man was standing here, quietly demanding to carry it for her. "Julian," she whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Tell me to step back, Clara, and I will. I will be your CEO and nothing more. But if you don't tell me to step back..." His gaze dropped to her lips for an agonizingly slow second before meeting her eyes again. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have the world at your feet." Clara didn't step back. She didn't want to. She reached up her small hand, resting flat against the solid warmth of his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "Don't step back," she whispered. Julian let out a ragged breath. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones, and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss wasn't demanding or rushed. It was a promise. It was deep, tender, and fiercely protective. Clara melted against him, her hands sliding up to grip the lapels of his shirt. For the first time in her adult life, she felt entirely, unequivocally safe. When they finally pulled apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed, a look of profound peace settling over his sharp features. "I've got you," he whispered into the quiet night. "I've got you both." 6 months later, the world looked entirely different. The harsh, bitter winter that had frozen the streets of the city had melted into a bright, golden spring. But the change in the weather was nothing compared to the transformation within the walls of Titan Corp, and more importantly, within Clara Hayes's life. Clara sat behind the expansive glass desk in her corner office, sunlight streaming over the dual monitors displaying the flawless green-lit data flows of the routing network. She was no longer the exhausted, trembling woman in the oversized sweater fighting just to survive another day. She was the chief technology officer of a global empire. Her dark hair was styled in sleek waves, and she wore a tailored ivory suit that radiated quiet, untouchable power. The door to her office opened, and Julian walked in. He didn't knock. He never did anymore. He simply stepped into her space as if he belonged there, which in every way that mattered he did. He was holding a sleek silver tablet and 2 cups of artisan coffee. "Good morning, CTO," Julian murmured, his deep voice carrying that distinct warm rumble that he reserved exclusively for her. He set her coffee down and leaned over the desk, pressing a lingering, devastatingly tender kiss to her lips. "Good morning, CEO." Clara smiled against his mouth, her hands resting briefly on the lapels of his immaculate Tom Ford suit. "You're looking remarkably pleased with yourself today." "I am," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. He handed her the tablet. "The morning financial briefs just came in, but I thought you might be more interested in page 4 of the Wall Street Journal." Clara took the tablet. The headline practically jumped off the digital page in bold, unforgiving letters. Asterisk former tech VP Nathaniel Reed indicted on 14 counts of federal fraud and extortion. Clara's breath hitched as she read the subtext. The federal grand jury had handed down a sweeping indictment. Nathaniel was facing up to 20 years in federal prison. The article detailed how he had systematically extorted an unnamed female employee, stripping her of her intellectual property while leveraging her child's medical insurance. He was bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and his legacy was entirely pulverized. The tech industry, which had once hailed him as a visionary, had completely blacklisted him. Clara stared at the words, waiting for the familiar spike of anxiety or anger that used to accompany Nathaniel's name. But there was nothing, just a profound, quiet sense of closure. "He's really gone," Clara whispered, looking up at Julian. "It's over." "He was over the second he made you cry," Julian stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He walked around the desk and pulled her gently out of her chair, wrapping his strong arms around her waist. "He will spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, entirely forgotten, while you, Clara, are about to take the stage tonight and be recognized by the entire world." Tonight was the Titan Corp Annual Innovation Gala, the most exclusive tech event of the year. For the past 3 years, Nathaniel Reed had stood on that stage soaking in the applause for Clara's genius. Tonight, the narrative was going to change forever. "Are you nervous?" Julian asked, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "A little," Clara admitted, resting her head against his solid chest. "I'm a coder, Julian. I'm used to being behind the screen, not in front of the cameras. You belong in the light, Clara, and I am going to make sure everyone knows it." He kissed the crown of her head. "Besides, Leo specifically requested that you wear the dress that makes you look like a superhero." At the mention of her son, a brilliant smile broke across Clara's face. "How was the school drop-off?" "Flawless," Julian replied, a distinct note of pride in his voice. He showed his entire second-grade class the customized tablet you built for him. He also told his teacher that his dad owns a skyscraper. Clara looked up her heart, doing a complex, beautiful stutter. Asterisk his dad. Julian and Leo's bond had grown into something extraordinary. Julian, the ruthless billionaire who had never factored a family into his meticulously calculated life, had taken to fatherhood with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He coached Leo's weekend soccer team. He read bedtime stories about interstellar travel, and he had moved both Clara and Leo out of the East End and into his sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. Most importantly, Leo was healthy. The premium treatments had worked miracles. The pale, fragile boy was gone, replaced by a vibrant, energetic child with rosy cheeks and an infectious laugh. "He called you Dad?" Clara asked softly, her hazel eyes shining. Julian's expression softened a raw, vulnerable emotion, flickering in his dark eyes. "He did. And if it's all right with you, Clara, I fully intend to earn that title every single day for the rest of my life." Clara pulled his face down and kissed him, pouring every ounce of her love and gratitude into it. "You already have. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." The Waldorf Astoria ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds flashbulbs and the elite power players of the tech world. The energy in the room was palpable as Julian Vance stepped up to the crystal podium. The applause was deafening, but Julian held up a single hand, and the massive room fell instantly silent. Clara sat at the center table, wearing a breathtaking, sweeping emerald green gown that caught the light with every movement. She looked regal, untouchable. Leo sat right beside her in a miniature custom tuxedo, happily eating a piece of chocolate cake and watching Julian with wide, adoring eyes. For years, Julian's voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system, commanding the absolute attention of every billionaire investor and journalist in the room. Titan Corp has been praised for having the most robust, flawless routing architecture on the planet. And for years, we attributed that success to the wrong people. A ripple of intrigued murmurs swept through the crowd. Everyone knew about Nathaniel Reed's scandalous downfall, but Titan Corp had kept the specifics of the brilliant mind behind the code tightly under wraps. Until tonight. We exist in an industry that moves fast. Julian continued his dark gaze, finding Clara in the crowd and locking onto her. So fast that sometimes we fail to see the quiet brilliance working in the shadows. We overlook the people who actually build the foundations we stand on. Tonight, we correct that. Julian gripped the edges of the podium. The architecture that runs Titan Corp was not built by a board of executives. It was built by a woman working 80-hour weeks. A woman who was pushed down, silenced, and betrayed, yet still chose to save this company from catastrophic failure simply because she refused to let innocent people suffer for our mistakes. The cameras were flashing frantically now. The room hung on his every word. She is a genius. She is a survivor. And she is the single greatest thing that has ever happened to Titan Corp and to me personally, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of profound public devotion. He extended his hand toward her table. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the honor of my life to introduce the true architect of our empire, our Chief Technology Officer, Clara Hayes. The spotlight hit Clara's table. For a second, she was frozen, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Then, Leo tugged on her hand. "Go, Mommy," he beamed. "You're the superhero." Clara stood up. The applause started as a ripple and quickly exploded into a deafening standing ovation. The titans of industry, the investors, the media, they were all on their feet, clapping for the quiet single mom from the East End. She walked up the steps to the stage, her emerald dress flowing behind her. Julian met her halfway. He didn't just shake her hand. He pulled her to his side, his arm wrapping securely around her waist, claiming her in front of the entire world. He leaned into the microphone. "She is the mind behind the machine," Julian announced, looking down at Clara with a love so fierce it made the cameras flash harder. "And I am stepping down as the sole face of Titan Corp. From today forward, we lead this company together." Clara looked out at the sea of applauding faces and then up at the man holding her, the man who had walked into her broken life and handed her the sword to fight back. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reigning. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Hours later, the noise of the gala had faded into the quiet hum of the penthouse. Leo was fast asleep in his massive bedroom, his small tuxedo jacket draped over a chair, a new high-tech toy clutched loosely in his hand. Clara stood on the expansive glass balcony, the cool night breeze playing with her hair. Below her, the city lights glittered like a million scattered diamonds. It was a view reserved for the masters of the universe, and now it was her home. She heard the soft slide of the glass door opening. Julian stepped out onto the balcony, having shed his tuxedo jacket and undone the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured against her skin. "The press is already calling you the most powerful woman in tech." Clara leaned back into his solid warmth, resting her hands over his. "It feels like a dream. If you had told me 6 months ago that the ruthless CEO of Titan Corp would be putting my son to bed and handing me half his empire. I didn't hand it to you, Julian corrected softly. You earned it. I just finally opened my eyes. Julian turned her around in his arms. The playful, arrogant CEO was gone. In his place stood a man completely, utterly captivated. I spent my entire life building an empire, Clara. Julian said, his voice raw and deeply emotional. I accumulated wealth, power, and influence. But when I stood in your apartment that first day and saw you fighting the entire world to protect Leo, I realized that my empire was completely empty. It was just glass and steel. You are the heart I was missing. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the absolute sincerity burning within them. Julian slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. That wasn't who they were. They were equals, partners. Instead, he opened the box right between them. Resting on the black velvet was a breathtaking, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring that caught the city lights perfectly. I don't just want you to co-lead my company. Clara, Julian whispered, his hands coming up to cup her face. I want you to co-lead my life. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to watch Leo grow up and build him the future you always dreamed of. I want to be your husband. Tears hot and joyous spilled over Clara's lashes. All the pain, the betrayal, the endless nights of terror and exhaustion, they were completely washed away by the steady, unyielding love of the man standing before her. Yes, Clara breathed, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, Julian. Absolutely yes. Julian let out a ragged breath of pure relief and joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect heavyweight that signified a promise that would never be broken. Then he pulled her flush against his chest and kissed her underneath the stars. The city below them continued to turn full of chaos and corporate wars. But up here, high above the world that had once tried to crush her, the quiet single mom and the cold billionaire had finally found their sanctuary. They had built an empire, yes, but more importantly, they had built a family, and no one would ever touch them again. Asterisk. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on Julian and Clara's emotional journey and their triumphant happy ending. Asterisk.